The other thing, the whole notion of responsible gambling sort of puts the onus on the individual that gambles. You are not being responsible. So we're going to help you be responsible by doing this. But it's basically your issue. Now, for somebody that has an addiction, that only adds to the stigma and the shame by saying, well, yes, you have a gambling addiction, but we're going to help you be more responsible.
I'm Sarah Grass, and this is episode 1 of season 2 of Hearsay from the Sidelines, a show about the place where law, sports, and culture intersect. Brought to you by Culture in Sports and Seton Hall Law School's Gaming, Hospitality, Entertainment, and Sports Law program. This season will focus on the explosive growth of the online sports betting industry as legalization sweeps across the country and the impact it's having on our relationships with our favorite pastimes. This season has taken me a while to put together for a few reasons. First, beyond passively consuming the never-ending advertisements that have taken over virtually every form of media, I have no experience with sports betting, online, in-person, legal, or illegal. I've never filled out a playoff bracket, I've never placed a bet on a horse race, I've never even had a fantasy team. I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've walked through a casino, which is all to say my learning curve on this topic was steep. Second, this is a well-traveled issue with legions of commentators, and it's been tough for me to parse out my own individual thoughts on the topic. But after several months of talking to a really broad range of people, including legal scholars, gaming industry insiders, higher ed administrators, government and tribal officials, as well as individuals involved in addressing gambling harms, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around it all. Like with season 1, I do want to let the information unfold, to let you listen and consider and reach your own conclusions. But the roadmap to the many competing interests, arguments, and issues on the sports betting debate was captured perfectly by the very recent Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on legalized sports betting. It was an all-star cast of witnesses: NCAA President Charlie Baker, Johnson Batamosi, a veteran of the NFL, former Assistant Attorney General and former Director of New Jersey's Division of Gaming Enforcement, David Rebeck, Keith White, Executive Director of the National Council on Problem Gambling, and Harry Levan, who is Director of Gambling Policy with the Public Health Advocacy Institute, a licensed therapist and a former lawyer in recovery from gambling addiction. While they each only had a few minutes to present their testimony, their statements are available online and are well worth reading. While I'm not really going to give a full recap of the hearing, I did want to highlight some of their main points and connect them to my plans for this season. Senator Durbin's opening remarks pretty much sum up the broader cultural experience of sports betting. Sports betting, now legal and live in 38 states plus DC, had its pivotal moment not too long ago in 2018 when the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA, was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in Murphy v. NCAA. And business is booming. Durbin stated that over $30 billion was bet on sports in the third quarter of 2024 alone, a nearly 30% increase over the prior year. And one sports betting site, Covers.com, puts the 2024 legal sports betting revenue in the United States, the actual earnings of the sportsbook operators, at over $10 billion in 2024. Quite a jump from the $1.5 billion earned in 2020. And while sports betting, like other forms of gambling, is characterized as entertainment, there are real concerns about its impact. Gambling as entertainment isn't new, but it can take many forms, and they're not all created equal. Here's Shelley White, who was CEO of Canada's Responsible Gaming Council, known as RGC, at the time of our interview, talking about how gambling as a social pastime has evolved and how that impacts the level of risk involved.
We do talk about gambling as an entertainment act. And when I say we as a society talk and think about gambling as an activity. And, I was speaking with an archaeologist recently. And I mean, there are artifacts from, century, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago that depict individuals gambling. I mean, this this is part of our DNA as human beings, this desire to play, this desire to compete, etc. So that is the intention of gambling. And you think that can be playing cards, that can be playing bingo. I was playing French language bingo with my grandkids on the weekend. I mean, and you think about decades ago, bingo being played in church basements. So I mean, it's part of think about all the movies we've watched, for example, that include casinos and gambling as part of them. So it's highly normalized, and it is a form of entertainment. However, like other things that we enjoy in our lives, or that are just part of our lifestyle, whether it's driving a car. I often talk about skiing because I'm an avid skier, or drinking alcohol. There are risks, right? And so with gambling, and it really depends, Sarah, on the type of gambling. So with land-based gambling, the risks are a bit different than they are for online gambling. If we look at online gambling, which there's been a huge growth in online gambling, you think about the fact that it is available. It's so easily accessible. You can online gamble on your phone or on your computer. So it's so easily accessible. Secondly, there's the isolation factor. You can be alone so there's nobody else around watching you while you're doing this and observing whether or not you're having a difficult time. There's no one there to provide you support. It's also available, in addition to the easy access on devices, it's 24/7.
But gambling harms weren't the lead story in the Judiciary Committee hearing. Instead, the first witness, NCAA President Charlie Baker, spoke about the impact of sports betting on the integrity of college sports and the well-being of college athletes.
There's no doubt that the rise of sports betting has impacted the NCAA and student athletes in a significant way. But none of the consequences are as challenging as the harassment and coercion student athletes are experiencing. We've conducted 4 different surveys over the last several months, and each one shows 10 to 15% of Division I student athletes have been harassed by bettors. More so in basketball and football, but in other sports as well. Student athletes publicly revealed they get demands for money from unhappy bettors for trivial things that don't impact the result on the field. But it doesn't stop there. Many have received death threats from bettors, and they also receive other in-person threats and accusations directed at them while they're leaving or coming onto the field of play. And unlike professional athletes, college students attend classes and live on campus. They're accessible to students and fans, some of whom, in fact, are probably the gamblers yelling at them when they're playing their game. Those differences increase the opportunity for threatening, coercive behavior across a massive number of participants in contests and create senseless risk. In many states, gambling regulators lack the authority to ban bettors for harassment. Instead, they rely primarily on the industry to share information across state lines. While we believe these disparities in state laws clearly warrant federal action, the NCAA is not waiting. We're lobbying states one at a time to make changes. West Virginia joined Ohio to pass legislation codifying anti-harassment measures related to sports betting. The West Virginia delegate who proposed the legislation represents areas bordering Pittsburgh. He noted the limited impact involuntary exclusion lists have when bettors can easily jump across state lines. In addition to West Virginia and Ohio, legislators and regulators ranging from New Mexico to Wyoming have advanced policy changes aimed at protecting student athletes from harassment by bettors. Despite the progress and the betting industry's persistent pushback, too many states with legal betting lack adequate protections for student athletes. That's why we're lobbying states to eliminate prop bets on individual student athletes. We understand sports betting's here to stay, and why it's better to have it regulated than not. While we work effectively with many in the gambling industry to uncover integrity issues, we disagree with the casinos on the issue of prop bets. On the issue of prop bets, we believe that when bettors can't gamble on college athletes' individual performances, they're far less likely to attempt to scrutinize, coerce, or harass student athletes. And several states ban these types of bets for good reason.
A prop bet, short for proposition bet, is a side bet on the occurrence or non-occurrence of some event during a game. A wager beyond who wins or loses and by how much. It could be something like which team will score first or how many minutes a particular player will play. But it could also be completely unrelated to the game itself, like how many times Taylor Swift will be shown on screen during the Super Bowl. And this, understandably, is both a lot of fun and also fraught with peril, as I will discuss much more in a future episode. Johnson Bottamosi described the treatment of athletes by overinvested bettors as, quote, dehumanizing in his written testimony, and warns that while legalized betting generates substantial tax revenue and economic opportunities for the leagues, though not necessarily for the players, it risks commodifying hope and devaluing sports as a pursuit of skill and integrity. The question is whether the commercialization of betting undermines the essence of athletic competition. This issue of integrity and concerns about the character of sport was the driving force behind the congressional decision to enact PASPA in 1992. Definitely more on this later. Yet when the door to legalized sports betting was reopened, state legislatures and voters seemed to forget all about it. And this is probably because legal and regulated online sports betting has some real upsides, like state tax revenue. According to Census.gov, sports betting generated national state-level sales tax and gross receipts of almost $506 million in just the third quarter of 2023. But if this money weren't going to the states and registered sports books, many argue, it would be flowing out of the country to unregulated betting sites or be used to fund organized crime. As lobbyist Bill Pascrell III, better known in his professional sphere as BP3, reminded me, betting on sports isn't new, it's just happening in plain view, a change which ultimately benefits the consumer, the bettor, as much as anyone.
If you and I were to walk the streets, and you're very young, but say 20 years ago, of any town, where I'm from, Patterson or Newark or Clifton or Jersey City or Camden, I guarantee you within a few minutes, we'd be able to find a street bookie and place a bet. That was the culture. In addition to the black market on the digital world, when digitization happened, people were betting on Bovado and Bodog, which are black market sites, not licensed, not regulated, not caring about the consumer.
Now to be clear, Bovada and Bodog are not illegal gambling sites per se, but they are not licensed to operate in the US and fall into the category of unregulated sportsbooks. And as BP3 says, just like a street bookie, because they operate outside our laws, consumers who choose to wager with them aren't protected by our laws, which highlights what is most often cited as the greatest benefit of legal and regulated gambling: consumer protection. Former director of New Jersey's Division of Gaming Enforcement and current advisor to the gaming industry, David Rebuck's testimony to the committee was focused on consumer wants and needs.
First, I want to emphasize that legalizing and regulating sports wagering is fundamentally about protecting consumers, the vulnerable, the underaged, preventing fraud, and ensuring the suitability of all entities to engage in gambling and their integrity of operations. Second, many states, like New Jersey, have enacted constitutional bans on gambling. However, our citizens, through constitutional referendums, have steadily acted to remove those bans. For example, in New Jersey, a multitude of well-regulated legal gambling options exist for decades before sports wagering, including betting on horse racing, creation of a state lottery, gambling on bingo, raffle sales, wagering on boardwalk and arcade games, and establishing casinos. Third, not unlike virtually every commercial function in our country, the confluence of the internet access and historical retail gambling games has substantially expanded the landscape of how citizens desire to engage in gambling. The total capacity for gambling today is as large as ever because its citizens desire the freedom to choose to engage in activities that were in the past prohibited. Wagering on sports is clearly defined by this new freedom. Before legalization, millions of people wagered billions of dollars annually through illegal operations and often committed fraud, evade taxes, and in many instances are tied to organized crime.
Reebok's comments reflect how deeply invested the gaming industry is in portraying themselves as simply providing an in-demand service in a legal and ethical manner, in contrast to their unlicensed competitors. In his written statement, he emphasizes, offshore sportsbooks also have no interest in monitoring the bets they are taking to ensure the integrity of the events they were placed on. For example, the operators of one offshore sportsbook were aware of the 2007 match-fixing scheme involving NBA referee Tim Donaghy. Instead of reporting it, they capitalized on it by placing their own bets. Of course, offshore operators that are brazenly misleading consumers and essentially participating in match-fixing and bribery here in the U.S. are not interested in providing players with responsible gaming tools, paying taxes, monitoring accounts for signs of money laundering, or engaging in know your customer protocols. This really isn't a new argument that he's making. It's one that has been made about legalizing marijuana and prostitution. People want it, and they'll do it whether it's legal or not. But if we provide them a legal regulated industry, we can protect consumers from the unsavory element operating the black market. And this makes sense to a certain extent, but it's also worth remembering that this isn't an act of altruism. Companies have a business interest in projecting a trustworthy and responsible image. Facilitating match fixing, misleading or taking advantage of bettors, getting investigated or sanctioned by state regulators, that type of behavior is not going to appeal to the general public, the people who were probably never visiting a backroom bookie or using offshore gambling sites. Those are the consumers who are feeding the sports betting boom, not longtime bettors who are shifting over to a more reputable option. Regardless of their motivations, gaming operators have warmed to the concept of responsible gaming, which is, in many ways, a good thing. Cole Wogman is the Senior Manager of Government Relations at the National Council on Problem Gambling, NCPG. In just a few short years, he's observed an increase in the sports betting industry's interest in RG.
I can speak from my experience, which is coming aboard in 2021, but I know that the operators, well, when we say the operators, it used to be mostly casinos, right? Now it's not. We've had a long-standing, working relationship with casinos, casino operators for years and years. So I don't want to imply that they only got interested in 2018 in our work. But because there's now so much money flowing into sports gambling, these companies are very interested in, for the most part, trying to make sure that they have a responsible gambling program and they're growing responsibly. Now, I can't speak to their motivations. I imagine there's probably a skeptical listener saying, well, they're only doing that because they want to look good or to help their public image. That might be the case. I don't know. But the fact is that more operators are coming to us and asking for assistance as they develop an RG program or how to make sure they're, training their employees. That's something we do, and how to spot a problem amongst bettors and that sort of thing.
Sidebar here, you'll be hearing this term, responsible gaming, a lot in this season. And until I started researching this topic, I was completely unfamiliar with what it actually meant. Essentially, it describes a set of social responsibility initiatives by the gambling industry to ensure operational integrity and to promote awareness of gambling harms. Here's how Shelley White described its origin story to me.
So this was a term that really emerged in the early 2000s. And it was a combination of, it was a term that was actually developed by the industry, but also significantly advanced through some research that some academics did. So responsible gambling really did originate as a response to a growing concern about the harmful effects of gambling. And it was developed by the industry to address those concerns and promote safer gambling. And in 2004, 3 academic researchers, so Dr. Alex Blazinski from Australia, Dr. Bob Ladouceur from Canada, and Dr. Howard Schaefer from the US came together and wrote this paper called the Reno Model, which really talked about that, preventing gambling harms had to be a collaborative approach between the government, the industry, and individuals. And RGC has really leveraged that and advanced that and broadened it to take a more public health approach. And what I mean by that is that, we approach our RG in terms of an evidence-based approach. So we do a lot of research, and we work with a lot of researchers, as well as incorporate other researchers' studies and findings into our work. It's a population-based perspective as opposed to individually focused. It's very proactive. It's designed to be proactive and preemptive as opposed to reactive. We incorporate the social determinants of health, and we look at the whole individual and society as a whole in terms of the approaches that we have to take. It's a very balanced approach. It certainly incorporates measurement in terms of wanting to ensure that we're having impact in terms of our approaches. So that's really fundamentally the difference, and that's the kind of work that RGC does in terms of, we're doing research, evaluation, as well as accreditations for operators in both land-based and online, as well as training and strategy development for regulators and operators, as well as, so we're both a B2B and a B2C. So that's all the stuff that we do for the B side. And then for the consumer and society, we're also developing and implementing evidence-based prevention education programs and services for, right from, kids that are in high school, right through the whole continuum of adulthood.
While responsible gaming might seem like an example of creative wordsmithing by the gaming industry, nonprofit organizations like the National Council on Problem Gambling and the Responsible Gambling Council are serious about their mission to minimize harms and promote ethical practices by encouraging the adoption of responsible gaming standards across the industry. They've spent decades supporting research on and treatment of gambling addiction, developing and refining standards and training, and lobbying for state and federal legislation, while remaining neutral on whether gambling should in fact be legal. Despite their broad range of initiatives, it's evident that the legalization of sports betting has created new and heightened concerns for those in this space. Here's a portion of NCPG Director Keith White's testimony to the Judiciary Committee.
We are concerned about the collision of three trends: vast increases in gambling advertising, especially exhortations to gamble during the game, advances in technology including mobile online sports betting, and a virtually unlimited menu of betting opportunities on the games nowadays, including some of the things Johnson mentioned, bets on players' individual performance. Mobile and online sports gambling technology provides opportunities to enhance responsible gambling features, including setting personalized limits and self-exclusion programs, but it also further increases risk factors for gambling addiction. And it's clear gambling problems have grown over the past 6 years, especially among young male online sports bettors. While this increase from 2018 is unprecedented, our 2024 data shows that the increase in risky gambling behavior appears to have leveled off, though there are still 9 million people, as Chairman Durbin said, with gambling problems, and it's far too early to assume the rates are stable.
One quick aside here. Shortly after this hearing, Keith White resigned from his position at NCPG after 26 years in the role of executive director. There was no explanation for the departure, but it has been described as abrupt. Despite this change in leadership, NCPG is still very focused on a piece of federal legislation, the Gambling Addiction Recovery, Investment, and Treatment, or GRIT Act, that would create a pathway for federal funding of state gambling addiction treatment programs by allocating a portion of an existing federal sports betting excise tax. This would be a huge step because, as Keith points out in his written testimony, public funding for state problem gambling programs was only 50 cents per capita in 2023, despite record tax revenues and operator earnings. The GRIT Act is not imposed on consumers, nor would it increase existing taxes paid by casinos and sportsbook operators. It would simply divert 50% of what in 2023 amounted to over $250 million in federal sports gambling excise tax from a general fund into block grants for states to use for gambling addiction prevention and treatment, and also go to the National Institute of Drug Abuse to fund grants for research into gambling addiction. Yet the gaming industry, as reflected by the American Gaming Association's vocal opposition to the legislation, not only opposes the GRIT Act, but is seeking to repeal the federal excise tax completely. The reason? It puts the legal regulated industry at a disadvantage against untaxed, unlicensed operators. And this is a refrain we will hear over and over in discussions of why the industry could, but won't, voluntarily limit itself in ways that experts believe would be helpful in addressing gambling harms. This is why public health advocates like Harry Levant discount the efficacy of RG programs as nothing more than industry self-regulation. Although he is the director of gambling policy with Northeastern University School of Law's Public Health Advocacy Institute and a certified addiction counselor, Dr. Levant has more than a professional interest on gambling harms. Once a practicing attorney, he lost his license to practice law and pled guilty to misappropriating more than $2 million in client funds because of his gambling addiction. His testimony before the Senate committee reflected a perspective informed by the breadth of his experiences.
We have known for more than 12 years that gambling is an addictive product, a gambling disorder and addiction similar to heroin, opioids, tobacco, alcohol, and cocaine. With every other addictive product, government regulates the advertising, promotion, distribution, and consumption. Sadly, with gambling, the exact opposite is occurring. The gambling industry business model is designed to deliver constant and nonstop action on every phone, tablet, and computer. With the use of technology and AI, the industry and its sports and media partners have turned every micro moment in each game or event into more and more gambling action. From the speed of the next pitch, football snap, basketball shot, as the chairman mentioned, even ping pong from Eastern Europe. The gambling industry and its sports partners have taken sports away from the children, families, and American people. Sports have become the equivalent of a non-stop slot machine. Understand, I am not opposed to sports gambling. In fact, I support its properly regulated legalization. However, I am vehemently opposed to what has happened in just 6 years. What has been launched on the American people is a newly created AI-generated online gambling business model, which delivers a fundamentally different, defectively designed, and inherently dangerous product to every phone, tablet, computer, and TV. The gambling industry has expanded to include once unthinkable partnerships, which include sports leagues, teams, owners, players, the world's largest media and tech companies, social media, AI, and state governments themselves. All are acting in concert to deliver online gambling at light speed and ensure the action never stops. The new AI-fueled business model will inexorably result in increased gambling addiction and gambling-related harm. I see this every day in my practice as a clinician.
Harry's remarks succinctly capture much of my own anxiety about the online sports betting industry. The speed and availability, the relationships between business and leagues, and also the normalization. He writes in his prepared statement, "Online sports gambling has rapidly become a normalized and socially acceptable activity. The convergence of gambling advertising, sports gambling partnerships, celebrity endorsements, media relationships, and the recently emerging role of artificial intelligence has dramatically altered how the gambling industry delivers and the public consumes increasingly complex gambling products." I personally have lived experience with addiction, not my own and not specifically gambling, but I have witnessed firsthand how engaging in illegal and generally accepted behavior can, under certain circumstances, develop into a full-blown addiction, but still remain hidden for far too long because the behavior itself is so normalized. And if all the gaming industry is willing to offer consumers are responsible gaming initiatives, they're missing the mark. As I discussed with Jeff Wasserman, a certified peer recovery specialist with lived experience in gambling disorder, these tools and strategies are completely inappropriate for individuals struggling with addiction.
Where the problem lies, in my view, is I think that there is, number one, a confusion in terms of what is responsible gambling. Can I, who have a gambling problem, then engage in some of the techniques or tools that are being offered and then turn my, harmful gambling into responsible gambling? To me, that flies in the face of what addiction is about. Addiction is for somebody or affects somebody that has no control, or their control is certainly insufficient to be able to either control their behavior or use, or to eliminate it, to stop when they want. That is addiction. Now, to say that, okay, but number one, you can do this and then gain control by taking advantage of some of these responsible gambling tools. And not only is that untrue in my view, but it's harmful in and of itself, because it could give people that may not be ready to seek help a lifeline, saying, oh, well, maybe I can now gamble responsibly. Now, I know for me, as somebody in long-term recovery, the only responsible gambling is no gambling. Simple as that. I can't gamble. And even if I thought that I could, it would be irresponsible for me to attempt to gamble, given the potential harm that I will face. So that's one area. The other thing, the whole notion of responsible gambling sort of puts the onus on the individual that gambles. You are not being responsible. So we're going to help you be responsible by doing this. But it's basically your issue. Now, for somebody that has an addiction, that only adds to the stigma and the shame by saying, well, yes, you have a gambling addiction, but we're going to help you be more responsible. And as you know, Sarah, responsibility is not something that we talk about with somebody that is, suffering harm from an addiction. It has nothing to do with responsibility and everything to do with an addictive disorder that's recognized as a mental health disorder. So again, I think that is an area that needs to really be weighed, and we have to navigate these waters very carefully.
So here's where I'm coming from as we dive into this topic. The legalization of sports betting is not inherently bad, just like gambling itself is not inherently bad. But in only a handful of years, it was launched out of backrooms into the mainstream. And yes, there are some great economic benefits to states, schools, and leagues that benefit large groups of people, but it certainly hasn't eliminated illegal sports betting. And the normalization of betting on not just the outcomes of games, but the actions of individual athletes has consequences. And we need to grapple with those, both legally and socially. If you are tempted to take the view that, well, I'm not interested in gambling and I'm never going to bet online, or I placed an odd bet here or there and no, I'm never going to develop a problem, so what's the big deal? I hear you. A big part of my brain leans in that direction. But I also have a 9-year-old boy who loves sports. Growing up in a world where sports and betting are so intertwined, it's almost impossible to see where one ends and the other begins. And so for my kid and all the kids, I think we need to face the reality that ease of access to sports betting combined with a business incentive to attract a new, largely untapped population of bettors will have an impact on the prevalence of gambling addiction. While gambling addiction is not a new behavioral disorder, there's far less research on and fewer treatment options available when compared with drug and alcohol addiction. If sports betting continues to expand, then there must be a parallel expansion of conversations about and resources for treatment of problem gambling on all points of the spectrum. Considering these issues and exploring strategies to mitigate harm is not a condemnation of the industry. I absolutely want to see legitimate businesses who create jobs and provide safe and fair entertainment options for those who enjoy betting to continue to exist. But state-by-state legalization and regulation without any national standards means that the industry will almost inevitably favor those jurisdictions who provide the most hospitable environment, leading me to wonder what the impact to the industry will be in those states with more restrictive regimes. Will they continue to reap the benefits of the online sports betting boom? Or will they end up competing with neighboring states for operator investment and consumer spend? And how will state legislatures respond? We also need to think critically about how allowing spectators to be so personally invested in the minutia of a sporting event changes perspectives on both players and competition in negative ways. Are athletes now obligated to contend with online and in-person abuse and harassment as part of playing the game? What about their families? If the answer is no, then we should have proactive plans for how we protect them rather than just reactively banning abusers. I'll be talking about all these issues and more, including the history of sports betting, how sports betting integrity is monitored, and what the future of this industry may hold. You'll hear from these and many more industry professionals, some academics, and other voices representing various facets of this debate. I hope you'll join me for the rest of Season 2 of Hearsay from the Sidelines. Hearsay from the Sidelines is a collaboration of Seton Hall Law School and Culture in Sports. Research and writing by me, Sarah Grass, with the help of my amazing research assistants, Emily Radish and Lauren Vuolo. Music by my son, Robert. Produced by Sarah Grass and Dr. Jeremy Piasecki, Executive Director of Culture in Sports. Links to all available academic and primary legal sources, media, music, transcription, and other materials mentioned in this episode are available on the Hearsay from the Sidelines show page, hearsayfromthesidelines.com. And if you like this show, check out cultureinsports.com, where you'll find more articles, shows, webinars, summits, and courses for sports leaders of all levels.